My brother stole my inheritance after Mom's death. His face, when I revealed the truth, was priceless. I don't say that for clicks. I say it because it's how the first week after the funeral felt, like someone ripped a sheet off the bed and left the mattress exposed to the room. He signed the closing papers. He walked out of the escrow office with the check made out to him, and to everyone who knew us, he was acting on Mom's wishes. That is who did it, what he did, and why it hurt. Because he stole what my mother left me. And he did it in a way that pretended to be honourable. We were close once. He was 2 years older and always the practical one. In our small town, he was the guy people asked to fix things. A leaky roof, a tax form, a stubborn car. When Mum's health took a steady, slow decline, he moved back into her house to help. The phrase meant different things to different people. To Mom, it meant company, and to him, it meant control. I had been here legally under her roof for the final 5 months, not because I lived there permanently, but because I was her emergency contact, the one who ran errands and stayed nights on bad days. I had a job that paid enough to cover rent and student loans, but not to buy a house or dispute a sibling who had suddenly found his conscience and a lawyer. I couldn't afford a long, ugly court fight at the time, not emotionally, not financially. That imbalance is important. He had savings built from years of overtime and a reputation for being dependable. I had grief and a ledger I had only begun to compile. The first betrayal came quietly. A week after Mom died, he told me he had contacted the attorney and that the will had been handled. He sounded like he was describing an errand he had completed for me. When I asked for details, he said I didn't need to worry. He told me he had sold Mom's old car to cover some of the estate expenses and that he had taken care of smaller debts. When I asked him who the attorney was, he said he'd used someone he trusted. I was at the house more than he was those first days. I answered nurses' calls at odd hours. I trusted him in ways I shouldn't have. 2 days later, I opened the mail and found an official-looking letter from the county recorder. Notice of transfer, sale completed, dated 3 weeks after the funeral, naming him as the buyer and the seller. The house, our childhood house, the one with the blue shutters and the paint chipped by the porch steps where Mum always sat in summer, had a new owner. He had signed on both sides. He'd listed the property as an heir's sale, filed as administrator, and the title had been reassigned. There was a cashier's check and a stack of papers with neat signatures. When I confronted him in the kitchen, the kettle still warm from tea, he looked at me the way a man looks who expects a mild inconvenience, not a confrontation. He said Mum wanted the estate settled quickly. He said there were taxes, unpaid bills, and a long list of people making a claim. He said he had sold the house to avoid creditors getting it. He sounded like he was reading a bank pamphlet and hoping I wouldn't see the seams. My reaction was immediate and small. I slammed a drawer too hard and then sat down because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The consequence was practical. I had to find out who the attorney was, get the escrow documents, and figure out whether any of it had been legal. The next week, when I started calling, answers tightened around the same shape. Yes, there had been a sale. Yes, he had signed. Yes, a co-heir was absent but had been notified. The situation got worse because the more I asked, the more my family shrank from the conversation. A new betrayal moved in the following month. My brother started delegating phone calls and then began delegating me. He would tell me a creditor had called and that he had already promised a portion of the proceeds. He would say, and say again, that Mum's estate was in flux and that I should not worry about my small share, that it was being held for taxes. Each time I insisted on seeing paperwork, he would produce a bill, a photocopy, a note in Mum's handwriting that seemed familiar enough to stop the questions for someone not looking closely. The effect was to slow me down and to make my insistence look like fussiness. I didn't realize the depth of his plan until I found the letter from the title company that had been mailed to an address I did not recognize, a P.O. box 2 towns over that had his partner's name on it. It had been forwarded from the house address, and the forwarding had his signature. He had redirected official mail. He had intercepted notices about probate and tax assessments. When I asked the post office what had happened, the clerk told me forwarding orders can be set with a phone call if someone knows your name and address. And I had been inside the house every day, and still I had not seen the thread he was pulling. My reaction that week was to start keeping a ledger. I wrote down every call, every name, every date. I printed emails and stored them in a cardboard box. The consequence was twofold. It made me feel like I had something to hold on to, and it made me a quiet target. My brother noticed I had started asking questions at estate sales and with the attorney, so he moved the next escalation to exclusion. At the second reading with the attorney, an awkward, perfunctory meeting where paper was signed, he told the attorney that I had been present at the house, but that I had left town in the weeks before Mum died. The attorney wrote it down, and the official file acquired a line I hadn't said. When I tried to correct it, I was told by the assistant that the file couldn't be amended without a formal affidavit, and that would cost money. At that point, I became the person who had to justify her presence at her own mother's deathbed. Pressure turned to quiet manipulation. My brother started to weave a narrative to others that I was volatile and grieving in ways that made me unreliable. He told a cousin I had made strange requests for sentimental items. He told the neighbor I had broken a picture frame. Small, petty claims that were easy to accept when someone else repeated them. A friend who had known me since high school stopped returning calls, saying she didn't want to get involved. The consequence was increasingly personal. People I'd assumed would be immediate allies put space between us. There were times when he used money as a weapon. Once, when I called to ask about a bank account my mother had used to pay utilities, he told me the bank had a pending lien and that the only way to free it was to sign a release form he had prepared. The form required I relinquish any claim to personal property associated with estate management. He phrased it as a temporary measure, as if he were doing me a kindness. I signed because I wanted the utilities paid and because the alternative was to be the person who let Mom's lights go out. Each signature felt like a small surrender. Each time a new lie or pressure came, my reaction shifted between practical pushes, phone calls, requests for documents, and deeper, quieter things, a sense of betrayal that felt like a cold thread in my chest. One escalation after another left me with a reputation fraying at the edges and a bank account shrinking under legal fees. The math was simple. To fight someone with more resources meant I might lose even the small things I had left. Then came the humiliation that hit harder than any ledger entry. At a family gathering, one of Mum's oldest friends asked casually which of us had handled the funeral funds. My brother answered readily, with an almost practiced humility, and the friend congratulated him for being so responsible. He shifted guest conversations to his competence. He had learned how to narrate his own virtue and let mine fade by omission. I left the gathering early and walked home in the rain because the embarrassment felt sharp enough to cut. Pressure turned into overt financial pressure. My brother began calling creditors himself to say he would be taking care of certain estate debts and that any payments I attempted to make would be misapplied. A utilities company told me they had received payments and then been told by his office to reissue refunds in his partner's name. A contractor who had worked for Mom's house claimed my authorization had been verbal and that the only bill he would accept was from my brother. These were small acts of rearrangement. Things that, alone, could be explained away, but together they formed a coordinated pattern. I made a mistake. It wasn't dramatic. I called the real estate agent involved in the sale and asked for a copy of the recorded deed, thinking I could use it to see what had been signed. The agent, who had been friendly to my brother at every step, told me they could not release it to me because the transaction was closed. I persisted in a way a cornered person does, repeated emails, a voicemail where I asked for the closing statement. The reply came back curt. Documents could be released to the seller and the attorney of record. That night, I broke down. I sat at the kitchen table under a lamp that wasn't mine and went through the cardboard box of documents I'd been keeping. I found a note in Mom's handwriting. Give the safety deposit key to Kara if anything happens. Kara, my name, written like a permission. I found the key taped inside the back of a magazine. I had been so busy checking the mail and paying vendors and keeping up appearances that I hadn't opened Mom's Bible or magazine stack for anything but tissue paper. The low point arrived soon after. When I went to the bank with the key, I learned I needed a variety of identification and a death certificate and a letter from the executor authorizing access. My brother had already been to the bank. He had changed the records, added his name as administrator, and the bank had frozen the box pending probate. There was a 2-week hold, then more papers, then forms requiring notarization. Each step had him listed as the authority. The weight of it hit me with a thud. Mom's small, private things were still behind a door he now controlled. The quiet, heavy moment, the low point, was that night in my own apartment when an eviction notice arrived for my rental because I'd missed 2 months' payments while answering probate calls and dealing with creditors. The landlord had been patient until a contractor he hired called asking to be paid or he'd take legal action. The possibility of losing my place at that sliver in life shredded something important. I sat on my floor and watched a photograph of Mom in a frame that used to hang above her kitchen sink and felt like someone who had been placed in an impossible choosing. Then a mistake occurred. His mistake, not mine. He became careless in ways that were human. Sloppy emails, a forwarded message that revealed a thread of texts, a cashier's check left on a counter with the memo line still readable. The trigger was small. It was a copy of an escrow closing statement I picked up off the floor of the kitchen after a storm blew the back door open and papers rustled like leaves. I had been packing a box of old sweaters and found the statement beneath a stack of pizza menus. I took a picture with my phone and then sat with it for a long time. The document was dated before the sale, and it named an attorney I hadn't heard of. My brother's name appeared as claimant, but the distribution line attached my name. It looked like someone had tried to hide a trace. The discovery changed the physics of the situation. For months I had been reacting. Now I had the beginnings of a problem I could take somewhere. I went to a legal aid clinic the next day and showed them the picture and the pedantic ledger I'd been keeping. They were measured and careful. One of the attorneys asked for the original. I said I didn't have it, only a phone photo. She told me sometimes a photo was enough to start an inquiry if it attached to a chain of custody and if other documents supported the claim. The next step was to get an official copy of the closing statement and to serve a subpoena. They would do it pro bono if the claim had enough corroborating material. Serving the subpoena was work that took physical steps, a filing, a fee waived for me, and a process server who appeared one afternoon at the real estate attorney's office. The man behind the desk treated the server like an annoyance and passed off a stack of documents. I watched, in that moment, as the veneer of competence my brother had built revealed a gap. His records were mostly photocopies and unsigned receipts. The escrow company had official records. The process server left with a thick envelope and a promise to review. The escalation after that was procedural, not theatrical. The subpoena produced copies of the recorded deed with signatures and notarizations. It produced bank stamps and endorsements I had not seen before. One paper had a notary stamp with a date that didn't align with the date in the photocopied check he'd shown me. The attorney at the legal clinic pointed out anomalies and said there was cause to file a motion to set aside the sale pending an accounting. She said the bank's records suggested the cashing of a check had not followed the chain the defense claimed. My brother reacted with fury, the kind that folds neatly into control. He began to send me terse texts, alternating between threats to file for an injunction on my behavior and pleas about how this is tearing the family apart. He accused me of grandstanding at the funeral. He called me opportunistic. He accused my friends of pushing me to make trouble. The consequences were practical. Family members were again asked to choose sides. Neighbours whispered in front yards, and my phone buzzed with messages I didn't want to read. Time allowed more details to surface. The attorney who had handled the closing had his registration examined by the court. He had a discipline history that showed previous small sanctions for paperwork irregularities. A title company audit turned up a pattern. When the seller was distraught or distracted, a particular local agent had a higher than average rate of quick closings. These things are never cinematic. They are paperwork and lists, names and dates, and they are slow. But the slow pile of facts started to become a framework. Consequences unfolded in realistic ways. So the court did not hand me the house or a giant pot of money. The title wasn't magically reassigned the next day. What happened was a series of hearings where that same practical competence my brother had narrated was examined under oath. Under pressure, a contractor he had paid to repair the porch admitted he had signed the seller's name because he'd been told the seller was out of town. A notary stamp was produced showing a date where the ink overlap didn't match surrounding entries. Little things that alone were not decisive, clustered together, formed a case that demanded explanation. In the weeks following the hearing, my brother's life changed in the small, grinding ways that legal trouble brings. He had to post documents, answer interrogatories, and disclose financial records that he had assumed no one would ask for. His partner's name, which had been absent from earlier paperwork, surfaced in emails about forwarding addresses and tempers. People in our town whose attention had been easily persuaded by his confident narration started to ask questions. The landlord who had been brusque with me earlier called to say sorry quietly, as if what had happened to me had been one more thing he had not noticed. There were social consequences as well. My brother's moral authority in the community dimmed as details emerged. He still had supporters, people who had been helped by him in the past or who disliked legal entanglements. But the polite assumptions that had previously smoothed his lies away were eroding. People I thought would never question him started to nod at things differently. A neighbor handed me a folded printout of a text where my brother had bragged about handling it and about how easily people could be persuaded with a steady tone. The small things piled up into a public change, the payoffs were balanced, the court ordered an accounting, and the escrow company had to explain where money had gone. Some funds were returned to the estate, others already spent could not be clawed back. There was a settlement negotiation where my brother agreed to repay a portion of the proceeds and relinquish his claim to the house. The house itself, however, had been sold to an unrelated buyer at a market price. Undoing that sale would have been more disruptive and likely impossible without forcing an innocent buyer into hardship. The law offered remedy in numbers, not in the restoration of a home to the person whose memories lived in the floorboards. Emotionally, the consequences were more complicated. My brother remained my brother. He apologized once in a way that sounded like someone who had practiced humility in the mirror. He said he had been overwhelmed and made choices. He had not offered the details of how he redirected mail or set up alternate accounts. Those things were written in exhibits and testimonies. The apology was brief. I accepted it in the way one accepts cold weather, acknowledging its presence without pretending the damage is gone. There is a softness to the ending. We talk less now, with silences shaped like apology. The house with the blue shutters sits in my mind like a place I once lived that I no longer can visit without a letter or a court record. Sometimes I drive past on purpose and watch dust settle on the porch. Once I saw his car pull up and then pull away, as if he realized at the last minute whether to go in. There is no satisfying image of seeing the truth reflected on his face in an explosive moment when everyone clapped. The change in him was quieter. When finally, a clerk handed him a bank ledger that contradicted his narrative, his face went blank for a second. Surprise, then comprehension. It was small and private, and it felt enough. There were smaller moments that felt like shards. Once, a cousin I trusted asked me in private why I was making trouble after Mom had died. She had been present for family dinners, for the awkward phone calls, and yet she asked me that plain question as if I had stolen sunlight. I told her about the forwarded mail and the notarized papers, and she fell quiet. She told me later she had been confused by two sides of a story and that my brother's calm made him seem like the safer choice. Seeing that hesitation taught me how persuasive a practiced voice can be. Another time, at the probate hearing, the judge asked a contractor under oath how he had obtained a receipt. He admitted the seller had not been present. that my brother had asked him to sign for the seller because the seller was ill. The judge's eyebrows went up and something shifted in the room. The contractor's answer was not a smoking gun, but it was a small lever that helped pry open a door. Each witness added a little friction to the smooth narration my brother had constructed. There were days that felt like small wars. I learned how to read bank stamps, how to follow a routing number like a breadcrumb trail. I sat with accountants and went through a bank ledger until numbers began to mean something besides anxiety. The legal aid attorney sat with me and said, "This is all small things placed together. It will take patience." She was right. Patience felt like a heavy commodity I had to ration. At the settlement table, the numbers were blunt. He agreed to repay a portion of the house proceeds over a 2-year schedule. The agreement required regular disclosures and banking statements. It did not give me the house back, nor did it restore the days he had taken from me. But it gave me breathing room. It meant I did not have to check my voicemail with a stomachache anymore. It meant, practically, that I could pay rent and not fear an eviction notice arriving in the mail like an accusation. Some of the community consequences surprised me. A woman I had not spoken to in years stopped me at the grocery store and offered a quiet, "I'm sorry." She had been swayed by my brother's performance but had watched the hearings, and her apology felt like a small moral currency being returned. It was awkward and real. It did not undo anything, but it did move something in me. In private, the hardest thing was the oscillation between numbness and anger. There were nights I would cry with old grief and nights I would rehearse questions for depositions until the sentences sounded like a song. I learned that grief isn't linear when it is accompanied by betrayal. It folds and refolds like a map you never quite finish reading. Over time, the folds loosened. I kept my ledger, paid the legal fees, and slowly rebuilt a rhythm of mornings that were not dominated by court dates. Looking back now, part of me is astonished at how ordinary the whole thing was. There were no movie-quality reveals, no bodyguards or dramatic trembling confessions. There were conversations, forms, forwarded mail, and a slow push by people who cared enough to ask questions. That ordinariness made it harder to name for a long time. It was betrayal dressed in the clothes of normal life. Life after the hearings was not dramatic. I did not get the house back. The buyer kept it. Some funds were returned and some were not. The settlement paid enough to cover the owed rent and to replace a few things that had been lost. The town resumed its rhythms, though conversations carried a new caution. I still drive by the blue-shuttered house sometimes. I park and walk slowly past the porch, feeling the hollowness of a place that was once mine by right of memory and not by law. Occasionally, his car is there and sometimes it isn't. We live now with a practical peace. If this struck a chord, leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe. Have you ever been surprised by a family conflict that felt quietly cruel? Tell me in the comments.